Picture for a moment the entrance to a medieval monastery. The air is cool, heavy with the scent of moss that clings to the stones. The walls rise high, built of thick gray blocks cut by hand, each one worn slightly by centuries of rain and wind. A wooden door creaks open, its iron hinges groaning. Beyond, a quiet world unfolds. A world bound not by wealth or adventure, but by silence, prayer, and discipline. This is the first step into the life of a medieval monk or nun. The cloister was more than a building. It was an entire world, closed off from the distractions of ordinary life. Once you entered, you surrendered everything. Family ties, possessions, ambitions. You traded noise for silence, freedom for obedience, comfort for austerity. It was a choice, and for many, it was not always a willing one. The walls themselves told a story. They were cold to the touch, often damp in winter, and echoing with even the smallest sound, the shuffle of sandals across flagstones, the faint ringing of a bell, or the whispered prayers in Latin. Candles burned low in sconces, dripping wax onto stone ledges. In the early morning hours, before the sun rose, the air smelled faintly of smoke from the torches that lit the corridors. Every hallway, every chamber reminded the residents that this was not a place of ease, but of discipline. When the monastery bell rang, deep and heavy, its sound carrying across fields and villages, life moved according to its rhythm. For the townsfolk beyond the walls, the bell was a reminder of the holy work being carried out inside. For those within, it was a command. The bell summoned them to prayer at dawn, to meals at noon, to rest at night. The hours were not theirs to choose. They belonged to God, and so their days followed a schedule centuries old, dictated by what was called the divine office. 7 or 8 set times of prayer, each requiring them to gather, chant, and recite psalms. Imagine waking in the darkness before dawn, the chill biting through your thin woolen robe. The straw mattress beneath you is lumpy, the blanket rough. A faint draft sneaks through the cracks in the shutters, and when the bell sounds, you rise without complaint, because obedience is the first rule. Your feet touch the cold stone floor, and you shuffle in silence toward the chapel. There, in the half-light, voices rise together, low, steady, and repetitive. The Latin phrases sung in plain chant echo against the vaulted ceiling. The sound is beautiful, but also monotonous, designed not to excite the senses, but to calm them, to quiet the restless mind. Life here had little room for individuality. Monks and nuns wore plain habits, coarse garments of wool, often brown, black, or white, depending on their order. There were no bright colors, no jewelry, no perfumes. Simplicity was a virtue. The body was meant to be humbled, not indulged. A noble-born novice, used to silks and rich meals, would have felt the sting of this change most acutely. A peasant, perhaps, found it less foreign. Yet even for them, the silence and discipline could feel suffocating. The contrast between monastery life and the bustling outside world was sharp. Beyond the walls, markets rang with the cries of merchants. Taverns filled with laughter, children played in muddy lanes. Inside, the only sounds were the controlled chants of prayer, the soft scraping of quills in the scriptorium, the rustle of robes in corridors. The cloister was an island of quiet, deliberately set apart. This world of silence and stone could feel eternal. Days blurred together, each one bound by the same rhythm of bells, chants, work, and sleep. Some found peace in this repetition, a kind of order that gave their lives meaning. Others, however, found it heavy, a weight pressing down with each passing year. There were temptations to break the rules, to speak when one was supposed to remain silent, to slip food from the kitchen, to let one's mind wander toward forbidden desires. The walls, both physical and spiritual, held them tightly. And yet, for all its severity, the cloister had its purpose. Monks and nuns saw themselves as living sacrifices, offering their daily hardships in service to God. Their lives were not meant to be easy. They were meant to be examples. Lamps of faith, burning quietly in the darkness of a troubled medieval world. As we reflect on this world of silence and stone, we are reminded that peace does not always mean comfort, and devotion does not always mean joy. To step into a monastery was to step into a different kind of life, one stripped of earthly pleasures, but also shielded in some ways from the chaos of medieval society. And so, as the candle burns low and the bell sounds once again, the monk bows his head, the nun lowers her eyes, and the cloister returns to silence. The heart of monastic life in the Middle Ages was not work in the fields, nor study in the library, nor even silence in the cloister. It was prayer. Endless, structured, carefully measured prayer. The hours of a monk or nun were not their own. They belonged to God, parceled out across the day and night in what was called the divine office, also known as the liturgy of the hours. From the first toll of the bell before sunrise to the last whispered chant at night, prayer was the rhythm of life. Imagine the sound. Voices rising in unison, low and steady, repeating psalms that had been sung for centuries. The words were in Latin, unfamiliar to the common people of the villages outside, but deeply familiar to those within. For the monk, or nun, each verse was as ordinary as breathing, and yet it was also the highest calling. The divine office was divided into set times, called canonical hours. The first matins often began in the very middle of the night, sometimes at 2 or 3 in the morning. The bell would sound, echoing through dark, silent corridors. Monks would rise from their hard straw mattresses, pulling rough wool habits around their shoulders against the chill. With heavy steps they would shuffle toward the chapel, the only light coming from flickering candles or small oil lamps. The chapel itself was often vast and echoing, with tall stone arches and wooden choir stalls polished by centuries of use. The air was cold, carrying the faint smell of incense from earlier prayers. As the monks or nuns gathered, their voices joined in chant. There was no harmony, no musical variety. The tone was plain, even monotonous. A drone that lifted the words, but avoided any distraction of beauty, was not meant to please the ear. It was meant to discipline the soul. After matins came lauds, usually at dawn. The world outside was waking. Farmers tending animals. Women lighting hearths. Children stirring in bed. While inside the cloister, monks were already deep into their second round of prayer. The cycle continued through the day. Prime in the early morning. Terce mid-morning. Sext at noon. None in mid-afternoon. Vespers in the evening. And finally Compline before bed. 7 or 8 gatherings, every single day, without fail. To modern ears, this may sound crushingly repetitive. And indeed it was. Imagine standing for hours, chanting verses in a language you may not fully understand, the same words spoken again and again, year after year. For a young novice, the monotony could feel unbearable. Yet this was the point. Repetition was meant to strip away pride, to drown out worldly thoughts, to remind each monk and nun that their time was not their own. It belonged entirely to God. The difference between rich and poor echoed even here. Wealthy abbots or prioresses might have had slightly more comfortable stalls to sit upon, their robes better woven, their voices stronger from years of careful training. Poor lay brothers or sisters, often less educated, might struggle with the Latin words, mumbling along uncertainly. Their voices blended, but their experiences differed. One singing with knowledge, the other with effort, both bound by the same rule. Hours of prayer also meant hours lost to other things. There was little time for personal reflection, for creative thought, or for simple rest. The schedule was rigid, demanding, and unchanging. Even when illness struck, many were expected to drag themselves into the chapel if they could walk. Prayer was not optional. It was the lifeblood of the cloister. And yet, within this discipline, some found peace. The monotony itself became a kind of comfort. Like waves lapping endlessly at a shore, the repetition smoothed the edges of thought. A monk could lose himself in the words, drifting into a rhythm where self no longer mattered, only devotion. A nun could close her eyes and feel the cadence carry her into quiet surrender. It was, in its own way, a form of meditation. For those of noble birth, accustomed to courts, chatter, and color, the silence of prayer could feel like a cage. For peasants used to back-breaking labor and noisy households, the quiet might feel like relief. Each came to the cloister with different expectations, but all were bound to the same unyielding schedule. The lesson of these long hours of prayer is one of endurance. To devote every waking moment to a cycle of chanting, kneeling, rising, and bowing was not a task for the faint-hearted. It required not only faith but also stamina, humility, and resignation. To live in a medieval monastery or convent was to live by the clock of God, where every hour was an offering and every day was consumed by ritual. As the candle burns low and the voices fade into silence once more, the monks and nuns file back to their cells. The cloister settles into quiet again. Outside, the village stirs with laughter, argument, and work. Inside, the rhythm of prayer continues, an endless tide, day after day, year after year, without end. When we imagine life inside a medieval monastery or convent, it is tempting to think of peace, learning, and quiet devotion. Yet the body still needed to be fed, and food played a central, though often uncomfortable, role in daily life. Meals were not indulgent, nor even particularly nourishing by modern standards. They were plain, repetitive, and carefully restricted. The monks and nuns did not eat to enjoy, but to survive, and to remind themselves that the body must be humbled if the soul was to rise. Step into the refectory, the monastery's dining hall. The room is long and narrow, with heavy wooden tables stretching down its length. Light filters through narrow windows, dust motes drifting in the air. The walls are bare stone, and the only decoration may be a crucifix or a painted saint watching silently from above. The smell is simple, bread baked earlier in the day, perhaps a faint trace of boiled vegetables, maybe the sharper scent of onions or cabbage. There are no spices to mask the flavors, no rich aromas of roasting meat, no laughter echoing across the tables. Here silence ruled even in the act of eating. While villagers outside might chatter over a shared pot of stew, monks and nuns ate in stillness. Words were forbidden. Instead, as they chewed on coarse bread and dipped it into thin gruel, a single reader would stand at a lectern, reading aloud passages from Scripture or the writings of saints. The voice echoed in the still air, breaking only for the occasional sound of wooden spoons scraping bowls. In this way, even meals became prayer. Moments not of comfort, but of reflection. The food itself was meager. Bread formed the core of most diets. Dark loaves made from rye or barley, heavy and dense, often slightly sour. With it came pottage, a kind of stew or gruel, usually made of beans, peas, or lentils. Vegetables from the monastery gardens added some variety: leeks, onions, cabbage, and turnips. In wealthier monasteries, fish might be served on certain days, especially Fridays and during Lent, when meat was forbidden. But meat was rare in most cloisters, considered a luxury and a temptation of the flesh. For many months passed without even a taste of it. The contrast between rich and poor was evident here as well. It's an abbot in a powerful Benedictine abbey, supported by generous donations of land and money, might enjoy finer loaves, imported wine, or even occasional roasted fowl. Wealthy convents could serve cheeses, butter, or preserved fruits. By contrast, small and struggling priories often lived on the edge of hunger, their monks or nuns sustained by thin broth and stale crusts. Lay brothers tasked with the hardest labor sometimes ate in separate halls, their portions smaller, their bread rougher, their bowls less full. Imagine the texture of the bread. Coarse, gritty, sometimes hard enough to scrape the gums. The pottage, steaming faintly in its wooden bowl, gave off the earthy smell of boiled peas. The taste was bland, filling the stomach but offering little pleasure. Sometimes herbs from the garden, parsley, sage, or thyme, would add a trace of flavor. But for the most part, each meal tasted much like the last, day after day, season after season. There were, however, exceptions. On feast days, Christmas, Easter, or the celebration of a patron saint, the monastery tables might be set with better fare. A rare roasted goose, a platter of fish, or honey cakes, sweetened with dried fruit, might appear. For a moment, the air carried the rich scent of roasting. The tables brightened with color, and the community shared in a taste of abundance. These feasts reminded monks and nuns of the joy of heaven, glimpsed fleetingly before the return to discipline. Yet even then, silence was often maintained, joy expressed only in bowed heads and whispered prayers of gratitude. The rules around food also extended into fasting. Many religious orders required frequent fasts, during which portions were even smaller, meals reduced to once or twice a day, and meat forbidden entirely. Hunger was seen as a test of faith, a way of subduing the body's desires. For a wealthy novice, used to sweet pastries or well-spiced meats, this could be a cruel adjustment. For a peasant, perhaps, it was not so different from what they had known at home. Still, the discipline of silence and the rigid schedules made eating less about sustenance and more about obedience. Reflection on these meals shows us how different the medieval understanding of food was. Today, eating is often tied to pleasure, celebration, or comfort. In the cloister, it was tied to humility, obedience, and spiritual discipline. Food was never meant to delight. It was meant to remind the monk or nun of sacrifice, of the fleeting nature of earthly pleasures, and of the hunger for God that should outlast the hunger of the stomach. And so, the refectory falls silent once again. The reader closes the book. Bowls are gathered, crumbs swept away. The monks and nuns file out, their sandals whispering on stone floors, returning to prayer or labor. Outside, villagers laugh around hearths, their stews flavored with whatever scraps they can afford. Inside, the cloister holds its silence, and the simple taste of bread and gruel lingers on the tongue. When night fell upon the monastery, darkness came quickly. There were no glowing lanterns in every corner, no fires blazing in every room. Light was precious, expensive, and sparingly used. Only a few candles flickered in the drafty corridors, their flames bending in the wind that slipped through cracks in the stone. Beyond them stretched shadows, deep, heavy, and endless. For the monks and nuns, darkness was as much a companion as silence. Imagine walking through those halls at night, your sandals pressed softly against the flagstones, the air cold against your skin. You can smell the faint wax of burnt candles, the sharper smoke of a dying torch. The windows are narrow slits, letting in only the silver glow of the moon when it is bright. Most nights, there is no light at all, only the sound of the wind against the cloister walls, or the distant hoot of an owl. Into this darkness, each monk and nun would retreat to their cell, a small bare room. There was no comfort here. The walls were unadorned stone, sometimes damp with moisture. A wooden cross might hang on one wall, a reminder of the life they had chosen. The bed was simple, a frame of wood, or in poorer houses, a pile of straw upon the ground. The mattress, if it could be called that, was stuffed with straw or rushes, lumpy and prickly. Sheets were coarse, blankets thin, barely enough to ward off the chill of winter. Winter, in particular, was cruel. The cold bit into the bones, and fires were seldom lit in the dormitories. Wood was precious, reserved for cooking, and for the communal hearth in the kitchen or infirmary. In the cells, the air froze, the breath of each monk or nun rising in small clouds above their beds. Fingers and toes numbed, and sleep came slowly, broken by shivers. In summer, the air grew stuffy and heavy, carrying the scent of straw and sweat. There was no escape from discomfort, no relief in the rhythm of the seasons. Unlike peasants outside the walls, who might huddle together in cottages crowded with family and livestock, monks and nuns endured their cold solitude alone. The peasant might be poor, but their fire was shared, their bed warmed by children, their hut alive with the noise of family life. In the monastery, silence reigned even in suffering. Each endured the cold in solitude, a reminder that comfort was a temptation best denied. Sleep itself was limited. The divine office demanded that monks rise in the middle of the night for matins. The long prayers that broke what little rest they had. A monk might lie down only a few hours before being pulled again from bed by the toll of the bell. Imagine the heaviness of eyelids, the ache of muscles, the struggle to rise from warmth into cold once more. And yet obedience was stronger than fatigue. They rose, wrapped their rough woolen habits around themselves, and shuffled into the dark chapel to chant once more. The contrast between wealthier and poorer orders appeared here as well. Rich abbeys could afford thicker blankets, better straw, even wooden floors that stayed drier in the damp. Poorer monasteries and convents left their residents shivering in the draught, the straw on the ground sometimes molding in the wet. Yet even in the richest cloisters, beds were never luxurious. Hardship was considered holy, a tool to humble the body and sharpen the soul. To modern ears, this life sounds grim, and it was. But in the medieval world, the denial of comfort carried meaning. To sleep on hard beds was to imitate the suffering of Christ. To endure cold and darkness was to remind oneself of the trials of the saints. These small hardships were seen as offerings, sacrifices made daily, quietly, without complaint. And so, as the monastery lay wrapped in shadow, the monks and nuns surrendered to their rough beds, their dreams often brief and broken. The cold seeped in, the dark pressed close, and the hard straw pricked at their skin. Outside, villagers gathered around warm fires, telling stories before sleep, children curled together for warmth. Inside, the cloister kept its silence, its darkness, and its discipline. The lesson here is one of humility. Comfort was not the goal of monastic life. Instead, it was deprivation, a steady stripping away of all softness, all ease, all distraction. In cold, in dark, and in the hard embrace of their beds, monks and nuns found what they believed was a clearer path to God. And so the candle burns down to nothing. The last flame flickers and fades. The cloister falls silent, the night stretching on, heavy and still. At dawn, when the mist still clings to the ground and the dew weights the sandals of those walking out from the cloister, monks take up their tools and march into the fields. For all the lofty talk of spiritual devotion, much of monastic life was bound to the soil. The rule of Saint Benedict made clear that idleness is the enemy of the soul, and so manual labor was not just tolerated, but sanctified. A monk bending his back over the plow was not merely a farmer, he was a servant of God, tilling the land as an act of prayer. Yet this was no light task. The soil could be stony, the seasons unkind, and the tools crude compared to what we know today. Wooden plows pulled by oxen tore through the earth, while hoes and sickles blunted quickly with use. Monks labored in the heat of summer and the chill of autumn winds, hands blistered, shoulders sore. The silence of the cloister extended here as well conversation was restricted, and work was often done in quiet rhythm, broken only by the scrape of tools and the lowing of animals. Fields had to be sown, weeds pulled, and harvests gathered. Grain was essential for bread, the staple of their simple diet, while gardens yielded beans, onions, and herbs. Orchards and vineyards, too, were carefully tended. As monasteries often produced wine for the mass and honey for sweetening food, though cloister walls separated monks from the wider world, the truth was that their survival depended upon this constant toil of the land. In every furrow, monks found both hardship and devotion. Now the labor was back-breaking, but in each swing of the hoe or each bundle of wheat tied for storage, they saw the work of God's creation, and the endless reminder that salvation was earned not through idleness, but through sweat and discipline. Within the cloister, far from the sound of the fields, another form of labor consumed the lives of many monks, the endless work of the scriptorium. This was no bustling library, but a quiet, cold room where men bent over parchment for hours, eyes straining in the dim light of candles or narrow windows. Their task was both sacred and grueling. To copy the Word of God letter by letter with a precision that left no room for error. The tools of this work were simple, yet demanding. Quills sharpened from goose feathers, ink mixed from oak galls, soot, or crushed minerals, and sheets of parchment scraped clean from the skins of sheep or calves. Each page could take hours to prepare before a single word was set down. The monk's hand moved slowly, carefully forming each letter, ensuring that not a mark strayed or a line wavered. One mistake could mean starting over, wasting precious parchment. The work was monotonous, yet exhausting. The silence of the scriptorium was punctuated only by the scratch of quills against vellum, the occasional clearing of a throat, or the whisper of pages being turned. The benches were hard, the air often chilly, and the hours long. Some monks found their eyes watering, their backs aching, and their minds wandering, yet the work could not cease. It was more than transcription, it was devotion. To copy scripture was to pray with one's hand, a labor of faith that demanded obedience, endurance, and patience. And still, the monotony weighed heavily. Imagine copying not just psalms or gospels, but entire commentaries, genealogies, or endless lists of names. The words blurred together, the meaning often lost to repetition. Yet in the dim light, monks pressed on, producing books that preserved not only holy texts, but also fragments of history, medicine, and philosophy. Without this painstaking toil, much of the ancient world's knowledge might have vanished. In the scriptorium, devotion and drudgery were one. Each page was a victory, each finished manuscript a testimony to the silent endurance of those who believed that words, faithfully preserved, were themselves a path to God. In many medieval monasteries, silence was not simply encouraged, it was commanded. To live under the rule was to surrender not only possessions and family ties, but often one's very voice. Words, unless necessary, were to be set aside, replaced with quiet nods, simple gestures, or the soft turning of a page. Speech, which in the outside world was filled with laughter, arguments, bargaining, and song, was here restrained, wrapped in a cloak of stillness. A monastery under the rule of silence had an atmosphere unlike any village or town. Imagine long corridors of stone, where footsteps echoed against the flagstones, and the flickering of torches cast wavering shadows on the walls. The sound of the world was stripped away, no gossip, no idle chatter, no heated debate. The only voices heard were those lifted in prayer or chant, when the community joined together to praise God in unison. Even then, the words were ritualized, repeated at the same hours, creating not dialogue, but solemn sound. For the individual monk or nun, the silence could be both a refuge and a burden. On one hand, it offered peace, freeing them from the distractions of idle talk. On the other, it denied them the simple comfort of companionship, expressed through speech. A novice, newly arrived from the noisy clamor of a village or city, would find the quiet unsettling at first, their tongue restless, their thoughts louder in the absence of conversation. The silence was meant to bring one closer to God, yet it often heightened loneliness. Communication did not vanish entirely. Monks developed systems of hand signals, allowing them to indicate when food should be passed, tools shared, or doors opened. In some monasteries, even these gestures were kept minimal, so that silence remained nearly absolute. Mealtimes were the hardest. The clinking of wooden spoons and the chewing of bread were accompanied not by talk, but by the droning of a lector reading aloud from Scripture, forcing each monk to consume both food and holy words at once. And yet silence had power. It transformed the monastery into a world apart, a place where the voice was no longer one's own, but reserved for God alone. It was a daily reminder that personal desires and worldly comforts had no place within cloistered walls. For some, the silence became a prison. For others, it was liberation from the chaos of the outside world. But for all, it was a discipline that reshaped not just the ear, but the soul, binding them to a life where voices were lost, and only prayer remained. To step into the cloister of a medieval convent was to step into a world apart from the rhythms of ordinary life. For nuns, the monastery walls were not only a boundary, but a barrier, separating them from the clamor of towns, the warmth of family hearths, and the chance of ordinary companionship. Once inside, life unfolded under the shadow of devotion and restraint, bound by rules that reached into every corner of existence. The convent was often built in stone, its walls tall and unyielding. Beyond them, the seasons changed, markets bustled, and children played in muddy lanes, but within, there was only stillness and order. A novice, barely in her teens, might pass beneath the gates for the first time and feel the weight of finality. The heavy wooden doors would close, and with them, the life of a daughter, sister, or bride-to-be dissolved into silence. Her new family was the community of sisters, her new husband the church, her new life one of prayer and obedience. The daily routine was strict and unbending. Nuns rose before dawn, called to prayer by the tolling of a small bell. Their beds were hard, their chambers bare, with only a crucifix or a single candle to break the shadows. Cloistered life meant repetition, hours of prayer in the chapel, the murmured chant of psalms, the rustle of habits as the women moved together in careful rhythm. Every gesture was regulated, every word weighed against the vow of silence that often restrained them. Meals were plain and sparse dark bread, thin pottage, vegetables pulled from the convent garden. Times the food was cold by the time it reached the sisters, yet they ate in silence while a designated reader recited from holy texts. To chew bread while Scripture filled the air was to be reminded that every act, even eating, must be sanctified. On feast days, perhaps there would be fish or sweetened wine, but such moments were rare and tightly controlled. The cloister did not only shelter, it confined. The women behind the walls were shielded from temptations of the world, but also from its joys. Many were daughters of wealthy families, sent to the convent as part of dowries or family strategies. Some chose this path out of piety, but others had little say. For the poor, entry into a convent was rarer, yet when it came, it offered survival food, shelter, and a chance at education otherwise unattainable. Thus, within the same walls, noble-born sisters and peasant-born novices lived side by side, equal under the rule, though their paths into the cloister were shaped by class. The emotional strain was real. Nuns who had known laughter, music, or even the touch of a family member often found the silence heavy. Letters to relatives were restricted, visits rare. Some women spent decades without once stepping beyond the convent gates. The garden, enclosed by walls, became their only glimpse of open sky. A simple flower bed or a patch of herbs was not just food for the body, but solace for the soul. And yet, in this life of restraint, many found meaning. The copying of manuscripts, the tending of the sick, the weaving of altar cloths. Task was framed as service to God. Within the convent, women could exercise authority otherwise denied them in medieval society. Prioress or abbess held power akin to that of a lord, managing lands, overseeing servants, and guiding her community with discipline. Still, even this authority was bound tightly by the church, reminding each woman that freedom was always limited. For some, cloistered life became a quiet liberation from the dangers of the outside world, protection from arranged marriages, from the risks of childbirth, from the turmoil of politics and plague. For others, it was a prison, where the sound of the church bell marked time slipping by, each hour consumed in prayer, each day a mirror of the last. In the end, the convent was both sanctuary and cage. Behind walls of stone, voices faded into chants, laughter into silence, and individuality into uniform devotion. It was a world where women were asked to give all of themselves, and in doing so, they gained both dignity and loss, comfort and confinement. Although monasteries are often imagined as places of equality where all men lived simply, prayed humbly, and served God without distinction, the truth was more complicated. Inside many medieval monasteries, sharp divisions emerged between those who ruled and those who labored. The figure of the wealthy abbot, living in relative comfort and authority, often stood in stark contrast to the poor lay brothers who endured the heaviest burdens of daily survival. The abbot was more than a spiritual guide. He was, in many ways, a lord. Dressed in fine robes of good wool, sometimes even trimmed with fur in colder regions, the abbot carried a staff of office and a ring that symbolized his authority. His chamber might contain a real bed with cushions, a fire burning in the hearth, and a private servant to attend his needs. He dined not on crusts of stale bread, but on fish, meat, and even spiced dishes brought in from the monastery's lands, though bound by the rule of St. Benedict, which called for moderation. Abbots often lived in ways that set them apart from the men under their care. By contrast, the lay brothers, or conversi, as they were sometimes called, experienced an entirely different life. These men were usually from humble backgrounds, peasants and laborers who entered the monastery not to study scripture, but to work the fields, care for the animals, mend buildings, and perform the most back-breaking tasks. They were not permitted the same education as choir monks, and many could not read or write. Their prayers were fewer, their hours of labor far longer, and their meals far coarser. If the abbot dined on fish, the lay brother might have only pottage of beans and onions, thick bread, and thin ale. The monastery grounds reflected this divide. While abbots and choir monks spent their time in the cloister, the library or the scriptorium, lay brothers trudged across muddy fields, guiding plows behind oxen or threshing grain in stone barns. Their hands grew calloused, their backs bent, their clothing patched and plain. At night, they slept in simple dormitories with hard straw mattresses, sometimes so crowded that the air grew damp and heavy with the scent of sweat and earth. And yet both groups were bound together. The abbot depended on the lay brothers to produce food, to till the land that gave the monastery wealth, to maintain the buildings that displayed its prestige. Without their toil, the monastery would collapse. In turn, the lay brothers relied on the monastery for shelter, for food even, if plain and for the protection that came from being part of a powerful religious institution. Still, tensions lingered. The gap between wealth and poverty was never fully bridged by the rule. Choir monks, many drawn from noble or wealthy families, spent their days in prayer and study, their voices filling the chapel with chant. Lay brothers, drawn from peasant stock, were often excluded from these services, given a simpler form of devotion. They stood outside the great choir, their voices quieter, their presence tolerated but not equal. In this way, even within walls dedicated to God, society's hierarchies crept back in. Some abbots sought reform, insisting on humility and simplicity, urging their monks to live closer to the ideals of poverty and devotion. But others fell into the trappings of power, enjoying fine meals, traveling with entourages, and using the monastery's wealth as though it were their own estate. Chronicles from the time occasionally hint at scandal. Abbots who grew too fond of feasts, too lenient with discipline, or too eager for influence at court. Such stories were whispered beyond cloister walls, reminding all that human weakness did not disappear under a monastic habit. For the lay brothers, life was one of resignation. They endured day after day, because the monastery offered security they might not find outside. In famine years, while peasants starved in the villages, the monastery still provided a daily crust of bread. In war, its walls offered refuge. And though they might never rise to the status of the abbot, they shared in the identity of the monastery. Their labor etched into every stone wall, every plowed field, every candle flickering in the chapel. The divide between wealthy abbots and poor lay brothers is a reminder that even within places of faith and devotion, society's inequalities persisted. The monastery was a reflection of the world outside, with its lords and laborers, comforts and deprivations. And just as in villages and towns, those at the bottom carried the heaviest weight, while those at the top carried the symbols of power. Yet, in the quiet of the night, when the church bell called both abbot and lay brother to prayer, their voices rose together in chant, blending into a single sound. In that fleeting moment, the divide softened. And the monastery's walls contained not lords and servants, but a community, united in faith even if unequal in life, for all their prayers, fasts, and disciplines. Monks and nuns were as fragile as any other men and women of the Middle Ages. Illness came often to the cloister. Slipping in with the cold air of winter, with the damp that clung to stone walls, or with the fevers that swept through villages and towns. To be sick in a monastery was to enter yet another rhythm of life, one shaped by the creaking doors of the infirmary, by the taste of bitter herbs, and by the quiet footfalls of those who tended the unwell. The infirmary itself was usually a long hall within the monastery, lined with simple beds or pallets stuffed with straw. Light fell in from narrow windows, illuminating rows of pale faces and bodies wrapped in coarse woolen blankets. The air was heavy with the mingled scents of boiled herbs, burning tallow candles, and the sharp tang of vinegar, which was thought to cleanse and purify. It was quieter than other parts of the monastery, though broken now. And then by the cough of a patient, the groan of one in pain, or the murmured prayer of a nurse. Care fell to fellow brothers or sisters, often aided by an infirmarian, a monk, or nun trained in the simple arts of healing. They were not physicians as we imagine today, but they relied on ancient texts, fragments of Galen, and Hippocrates preserved in the monastery library mixed with folk knowledge passed down from peasants and midwives. Healing was as much spiritual as physical. Prayers were whispered over the sick, holy water sprinkled, relics placed close to the patient's body. Alongside these remedies of honey, garlic, wine, or crushed herbs were given, their bitterness swallowed with the hope that God would grant relief. For the wealthy abbot or prioress, sickness was softened by privilege. Their beds were placed in quieter corners, their meals enriched with meat broth or rare spices, thought to restore strength. They might have their own attendants to watch through the night, adjusting blankets, warming stones to ease their aches. By contrast, a lay brother, worn thin from labor, or a young novice nun, might find only the barest carabole of watery gruel, a rough cloth soaked in vinegar pressed to the forehead, a whispered reminder to endure their suffering patiently, for sickness was often seen as a trial of faith. The seasons shaped the infirmary. In winter, the cold bit sharply, seeping through walls no matter how many blankets were piled upon the sick. In summer, heat brought flies, the stench of sweat and fevers that spread quickly from bed to bed. During times of plague, even the infirmary became overwhelmed. Rows of bodies stretched beyond its walls, monks and nuns praying as death stole one after another. Some infirmarians died themselves in service, caught by the very illnesses they tried to soothe. And yet, the infirmary was not only a place of suffering. For some, it was a rare moment of gentleness within a harsh life. The touch of a cool hand upon the brow, the quiet of the hall, the murmured chant of a psalmist could feel like compassion made real. For novices, especially, who had known little but strict rules and cold beds, illness sometimes offered a kind of pause, a slowing down, a chance to be cared for in a way otherwise denied. Still, recovery was uncertain. Medicine was limited, and many ailments could not be healed. Death was common, and the infirmary often served as a waiting place for the soul, a place where prayers grew softer, breaths shallower, and the tolling of the monastery bell announced another departure. Brothers and sisters alike believed that suffering purified the spirit, drawing one closer to God. In this way, the infirmary was not only a place of healing, but of preparation for either recovery or the journey beyond life. The medieval infirmary reminds us that even within walls of discipline and silence, the body remained fragile, prone to sickness, and in need of tenderness. Here, amidst the harsh realities of monastic life, a different truth revealed itself, that endurance was not only about labor and prayer, but also about care, compassion, and the acceptance of human frailty. For all the vows of purity, obedience, and poverty that monks and nuns swore before God, they remained human creatures of flesh as well as spirit. Behind the stone walls of cloisters and convents, temptation still stirred, sometimes in subtle whispers, sometimes in overwhelming waves. The medieval church saw monasteries as fortresses of holiness, yet even within those sanctuaries, the struggles of desire and sin quietly unfolded. The human body was not easily subdued. Young novices sent into the cloister at 14 or 15 carried with them the restless energy of youth. Their days were filled with prayer, fasting, and labor designed to discipline the flesh, to bend it beneath the will of God. But long nights on hard beds, cold corridors lit by wavering candles, and the silence of endless hours gave space for the mind to wander. In dreams, in memory, in secret thoughts, temptation often intruded. The church taught that the devil prowled, especially near monasteries, for to corrupt a monk or nun was to corrupt one who had pledged their life to holiness. Stories circulated of monks tormented by visions of women, or of nuns visited in their cells by dreams too vivid to ignore. Fasting, self-flagellation, and long hours of prayer were prescribed as remedies, not only against sin itself, but against the very thought of it. Yet repression only sharpened the struggle. To be holy was to be constantly at war with the self. Some failed. There are records quietly noted in chronicles of monks caught slipping away to villages, of nuns found meeting strangers beyond convent walls, of secret children born of vows broken. These scandals often brought shame not only to the individuals, but to the entire monastery. Punishments could be harsh: public confession, expulsion from the cloister, or lifelong penance within a stricter order. And yet, the fact that such rules existed reminds us how common the transgressions must have been. For the wealthy and powerful within monasteries, temptation often took another form: ambition and greed. Abbots sought influence at courts, nuns from noble families fought for privileges, and the vow of poverty was sometimes softened by the comfort of fine food or private possessions. In this sense, temptation was not only of the flesh, but of pride, of vanity, of the desire to live more gently than the rule allowed. The poor lay brothers and sisters wrestled with different temptations. For them, hunger was a constant companion, and the temptation to sneak extra food from the kitchens was strong. Others longed for the families they had left behind, slipping into melancholy that the church sometimes called acedia, spiritual weariness that dulled both devotion and joy. Temptation in this sense was not always lust or greed, but the simple human longing for warmth, comfort, and connection. The atmosphere of the monastery heightened these struggles. Imagine long corridors echoing with the toll of the bell, cells dark except for the weak flame of a tallow candle, air thick with incense in the chapel. The senses were narrowed, controlled, pressed into rhythm. But in that very narrowing, the desires of the body often grew sharper. The touch of cold stone reminded the monk of warmth once known. The taste of plain bread reminded the nun of feasts she had abandoned. The silence reminded both of voices lost of laughter, of conversation, of intimacy. And yet the struggle itself was seen as holy. Brez was to grow closer to God. Each temptation was a trial, each moment of doubt a battlefield of the spirit. Those who endured believed they purified themselves through discipline. Those who stumbled found forgiveness only in confession and penance. In this way, temptation and sin were woven into monastic life, not as interruptions, but as constant companion shadows cast by the vow of devotion. The story of temptation in monasteries reveals the paradox of the human soul. Behind walls meant to shield them from the world, monks and nuns discovered that the greatest battle was not with the world outside, but with the restless heart within. And in this struggle, they were no different from the peasants in the fields or the nobles in their castles bound by flesh, longing for comfort and forever seeking the grace of forgiveness. Within the quiet walls of a medieval monastery, obedience was not simply a virtue. It was the very backbone of communal life. Every monk, from the youngest novice to the most seasoned elder, lived under a strict hierarchy designed to mirror divine order. At the summit of this structure stood the abbot, regarded as the earthly representative of Christ within the community. His word was law, and his judgments carried spiritual weight. To disobey him was to disobey God. Beneath him, roles cascaded downward in carefully arranged layers. Priors, sub-priors, cellars, infirmarians, and novices each carried responsibilities that were both practical and spiritual. A cellarer, for instance, might oversee the stores of grain and ale, ensuring nothing was wasted, while also modeling humility and charity to his brothers. A novice, often little more than a boy, would be assigned menial tasks, sweeping floors, tending gardens, or cleaning chambers not as punishment but as a means of learning the discipline of service. The hierarchy was not meant to reward ambition but to crush it. Personal desires and ambitions were regarded as dangerous temptations, capable of poisoning the communal harmony. A monk who resisted an order, even a small one, might find himself enduring public penance, kneeling before the entire community, confessing his stubbornness, or performing extra labor in silence. Obedience was thus not only expected but tested daily. The weight of such obedience could be heavy. For some monks, the continual surrender of personal will was a lifelong struggle. Yet within this surrender, they believed lay the path to freedom. The freedom from pride, from selfishness, and from the distractions of the world beyond the cloister. The monastery's hierarchy, rigid though it was, served as both a burden and a guide, pressing each monk into the shape of humility and faith. Within the monastery, no space held greater power over the mind and soul than the church itself. Built of stone and wood, sometimes modest, sometimes magnificent, the church was the heart of monastic life. Its tall arches and vaulted ceilings created an atmosphere of awe, where the faintest whisper or footsteps seemed to linger in the air. Light filtered through narrow stained glass windows or plain, leaded panes, softening the space with shifting hues at certain hours of the day. This was not merely a building, it was a sacred vessel, enclosing the divine presence. The daily rhythm of the monks was bound to this space. At the ringing of the bell, they would file into the church, robes brushing the cold floors, each step measured and quiet. Here, the divine office, the cycle of psalms, prayers, and chants was performed at regular intervals. Matins might call them from their beds in the deep of night, while vespers drew the day to a close in the golden light of evening. These rituals were not hurried or casual. They unfolded with a slow, deliberate cadence that seemed to stretch time itself. The sound of chanting filled the church with an otherworldly resonance. Voices rose and fell together in harmony, merging into a single stream of prayer. The Latin words may have been unintelligible to most, yet their repetition carried the weight of centuries. Candles flickered at the altar, their small flames pushing back the shadows, while incense curled upward, filling the air with a heavy sweetness that clung to stone and cloth alike. For the monks, the church was a place where the ordinary world ceased to exist. Inside, there was no concern for whether harvests or personal burdens. Instead, there was surrender to the rituals, the community, and ultimately to God. Even silence itself was a ritual here, a silence punctuated only by prayer, bells, or the echo of footsteps against ancient stone. In this sacred space, rituals became a kind of anchor. No matter how weary the body or distracted the mind, the familiar structure of the liturgy brought the monks back to a center, reminding them of their purpose. The church, echoing with centuries of devotion, stood as a constant reminder that their lives were not their own, but part of a timeless order of worship. To enter a monastery was to step into a world where time moved differently. Beyond the gates and cloister walls, kingdoms rose and fell, wars raged, and cities bustled with life. But inside the monastery, the rhythm of existence seemed almost eternal. The monks did not measure life by days or years, but by the tolling of bells, the cycle of prayers, and the turning of seasons. Each generation of brothers inherited this rhythm from those who came before, continuing an unbroken chain of devotion that stretched across centuries. For a novice, the first weeks of monastic life could feel overwhelming, nights broken by sudden bells calling him to matins, mornings filled with manual labor, and days structured with prayers that never ceased. Yet with time, these once strange patterns became second nature. The same psalms chanted by the elder monks had been sung by countless voices long before, and would continue to be sung long after the novice's life had ended. To live in a monastery was to surrender not only one's individuality, but also one's sense of time as a personal possession. Generations of monks often lived and died in the same place, buried in the quiet cemetery beyond the cloister. Their graves, marked only with modest stones or wooden crosses, bore witness to lives that might otherwise seem forgotten. But in the daily prayers, their memory lingered. The monastery itself carried their presence. Worn steps in the cloister walks, smooth depressions on wooden pews, faint ink stains on manuscripts. Every corner bore the marks of those who had lived the same routine, decades, even centuries before. Time inside a monastery could feel both heavy and light. Heavy, because each day mirrored the last, with little change, stretching into what seemed an endless repetition. Light, because the hours dissolved into the greater flow of eternity, where the individual mattered less than the continuity of prayer and worship. The monks lived not for the world outside, but for an existence beyond it, a hope that their fleeting years, merged with generations past and yet to come, would weave into a greater tapestry of devotion. Thus, monastic life carried the weight of time in ways few others experienced. The individual monk might feel small, even insignificant, but together, across generations, they formed a living tradition. To walk the cloister was to walk in the footsteps of those who had walked it centuries before, whispering the same prayers, carrying the same burdens, surrendering themselves to the same unending rhythm of sacred time. As we reach the quiet end of our journey through the cloisters, refectories, dormitories, and chapels of the medieval monastery, we are left with a picture that is neither entirely serene nor entirely bleak. The life of monks and nuns was full of hardship, cold. Stone walls in winter, hard wooden beds, plain and often meager food. Silence that pressed heavily upon the mind, and obedience that tested the will. Yet within this world of denial and repetition, there was also endurance. The monastery was built upon sacrifice. To leave behind family, possessions, and the noisy pleasures of the world was no small step. A young man or woman entering the cloister knew that their lives would be given over to prayer, work, and devotion without pause. This sacrifice often brought suffering, loneliness, hunger, illness, and the constant temptation of a life imagined but never lived. But from that sacrifice also came meaning. In their hardship, monks and nuns believed they touched eternity. Every weary step to the chapel, every whispered psalm in the dark of night, every hour spent copying sacred words, all were seen as offerings, threads woven into the greater pattern of faith. It is easy, centuries later, to view their lives as oppressive, as a weight of rules and restrictions pressing down upon human spirit. And yet it is also true that many of them found peace within this order. The repetition that could numb the mind also stilled it. The silence that seemed like loss of voice became a gateway to contemplation. The poverty that stripped them of comfort offered freedom from envy and pride. Their lives were not lived for the moment, but for a higher horizon, one they believed stretched beyond death. Still, the hardships remain undeniable. Disease often cut lives short, cold winters claimed many, and hunger gnawed even within abbey walls. Not every monk endured with patience, and not every nun accepted her vows with serenity. There were moments of rebellion, quiet tears, and hidden doubts. Yet, despite these struggles, the communities endured. The monasteries outlived kings, dynasties, and empires. Their bells rang through plagues, through wars, and through famines. They became keepers of memory, of knowledge, of prayer, standing as beacons of continuity in a world ever restless. The endurance of monks and nuns was not one of triumph or conquest, but of persistence. Day after day, they rose to pray, to work, and to live in the same rhythm passed down for generations. It was not an easy path, nor one free of suffering, but it was a path walked with faith. Their lives remind us that endurance often takes quiet forms. The simple act of rising each day, the strength to accept hardship without complaint, the patience to continue when comfort is gone. As you drift now toward rest, let these reflections linger gently. The story of monks and nuns is not only a tale of cold cloisters and endless prayer, but also of resilience in the face of trial, of the human capacity to find meaning even in denial, and of the enduring belief that hardship, born with faith, can shape the soul. History reminds us that even in hardship, people endured. You may rest peacefully.